right into the dialogue around the patronage tax for today's conversation. So with that, I will pause here and I'll turn it over to both you, Robyn, and Dave to get us started.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. So are you going to put our slides up?
You got it. I'm going to click next. You just let me know when you want me to keep going.
Yeah. You ready, Robyn?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, so I'm Dave Swanson, Minneapolis. I am a lawyer. I've worked with co-ops almost exclusively for over 40 years and kind of fell in love with it when I first started realizing what a co-op was. I grew up in a kind of rural area in Minnesota, and there were co-ops all over the place. Co-op stores, co-op gas stations, agriculture co-ops, electric co-ops. And I went to law school and spent 3 years learning about, various types of corporations and all this legal stuff. Never once heard about a co-op. And then I got a job in Chicago working for a law firm that was doing a lot of financing work with rural electric co-ops. So it kind of piqued my interest, and I started trying to figure out, oh, what is this co-op thing? And realized it's a much different thing than a brand name on a store or a gas station. And that sent me into that's what got me involved in this co-op thing. Moved back up to Minneapolis quite a few years ago and got in a law firm that had a lot of co-ops. There's a lot of co-ops in Minnesota, as there are in many of the Midwest states here. So I'm going to start by just defining what is a co-op. There's a lot of different ways to define it. And people use the term co-op with a lot of different meanings. But somebody mentioned principle, or some of the principles earlier. One of the there's an international body called the ICA, or International Cooperative Association. And it has, I think, co-ops from like 8 different sectors around the world. The US is one of them, and Europe is one of them. And they gather for meetings several times a year. There's a board of directors, I think, of about 45 people, and NCBA always sends one person to that board. And they have defined what a co-op means with these 7 co-op principles. And they're fairly straightforward, voluntary open membership, democratic control, member economic participation, which is a key thing in a co-op, autonomy and independence, education. Almost all co-ops have a fairly significant involvement in co-op education, and so does NCBA. Cooperation among cooperatives, and you see a lot of Principle 6. A lot of people talk about co-ops should work together, and there's co-ops in a lot of different sectors: agriculture, natural foods co-ops, worker co-ops, or employee-owned co-ops, and they do try to work together in many different ways, or collaborate together. And then concern for community, which really, I think, in my mind, kind of defines what a co-op is more than anything else. It's not just thinking about how much profit you can make or how big you can grow, but it's also thinking about or focused on what good are you doing for the community that you're operating in. And that, to me, is kind of the main differential between a co-op and another form of business. I'm going to add this, I mentioned the ICA. And by the way, I've been on the board of NCBA for about 15 years and involved with it since the 80s. But right now, there's the International Cooperative Association, ICA, is on having discussions. It's been going on for a couple of years about whether there should be an 8th cooperative principle, which is basically DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I actually got to listen to some of the discussions at the ICA level and hear reports about it from the NCBA people. And basically, I think the United States and maybe Europe and a couple of regions would be very much in favor of having a principle 8 that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. But there's a lot of other places, China, South America, Africa, that are not in favor of adding that, on the theory that it's already included in the democratic member control, voluntary and open membership, and those concepts. So let's talk about it. Robyn, anything you want to add about that?
No.
Does
Keep
your
going, Dave.
co-op, you put the 7 principles on any of your materials? A lot of co-ops do.
I feel certain that the cooperative principles are stamped someplace on Co+op U, yes. And Co+op U is NCG's the educational platform for our members.
Oh, right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, interesting. The co-op principles are it's very interesting to me. Like I'm going to talk a little bit about where do you see co-ops thrive, and one of them is in or a lot of it is rural areas. There's agriculture co-ops that have been, it's owned by farmers around for well over a century. And then we have a system of rural electric co-ops in the United States that was really started by a U.S. Department of Agriculture program in the maybe 30s or so. And it really boiled down to this: a for-profit company would build power plants and electric delivery lines in a densely populated area, but they wouldn't string lines in the rural areas because it was just too expensive to do that. Instead of having 200 customers per mile of line, they'd have, or 1,000, they'd have 2 or 3 farms. So it just wasn't very cost effective for them to do that. And that resulted in this whole rural electric and rural telephone system that we have in the United States today. And most of the US rural areas, if you live there, you buy your electricity from a co-op and you become a member. And a lot of people don't even realize that they're a member of a co-op. And electricity is a little unique because you don't have competition for who your electric supplier is almost anywhere. California allows you to pick your electric supplier, but other than that, it's your electric supplier is decided by where you live. So a lot of people who are members of co-ops don't even realize they're members of co-ops in this area. And they're rural and fairly, that means fairly conservative, but rural US really likes the co-op model. And so you have a kind of an interesting dynamic where if you look at the websites of the rural electric co-ops or rural telephone co-ops, they almost always have these Rochdale principles laid out as part of what they're doing. But at the same time, they buy their power from coal plants. And the coal plants were, the electric system started out in the US with, in the rural areas with federal dollars. It was a United States Department of Agriculture program. They used to call it REA, now it's called RUS, our Rural Utilities Service. and they financed it, and they helped, get lines in the rural areas, historically 30s, 40s, and 50s. They, most of the co-ops were buying their electricity from federal hydropower, because the federal government has dam systems all over the US. And so they didn't just, block the water and pool the water. They also let it roll through hydroelectric system, generators and send electricity to the rural customers. And then somewhere along the line, maybe the early 70s or late 60s, they started realizing the growth of the population growth in the rural areas was getting to be too big to really manage, or for the hydroelectric system to supply all of the farms and all the small towns. So the federal government, USDA started telling the electric co-ops, you've got to build coal plants. And they built coal plants with financing from the federal government. And and most of the coal plants that are still operating now, or an awful big percentage of them, are serving rural areas. So you have this kind of interesting dynamic going on where the electric system the rural electric system used to be just rural, and now, because the cities are expanding, they're not just rural anymore. They're rural and exurban or suburban. And so the mindsets about how they work together to deliver electricity is very different, and it's causing a lot of drama amongst this whole rural electric co-op world about, well, should we shut down our coal plants? And if we do, who pays for it? Is it going to be the rural people, or is it going to be the exurban people, or is it going to be a broader sector of the society that pays for shutting down these coal plants?
Dave, I think we need to start talking about tax laws.
Oh, so you want to keep it rolling. Thank you. I thought we had a lot of time here. So let's move on. Tax laws. There are, I mentioned this, that there's, there's a lot of different kinds of co-ops from a tax standpoint. And one of the principal differentiators of a co-op and other kinds of companies is the tax status. And we have a law in the US that says, it's called Subchapter T of the tax code. It's only a few pages long, and I'll describe kind of the basics of it, but it's a lot more complicated than we could do in 12 hours, let alone, a few minutes. But basically, Subchapter T says that if you're operating on a cooperative basis, then you can avoid paying tax at both the owner level and the company level. So if a corporation makes profit, they have to pay tax. And then if they give a dividend to the owners have to pay a tax too. But that doesn't happen in a co-op. So that's basically the main tax differentiator between a co-op and a corporation or a partnership. And partnerships have complete pass-through tax. So the only person who pays the tax is the partner. But in a co-op, there can be tax at both levels. And in order for, let me move this. Let's see.
You want me to hit the next slide?
Yes, please do.
You got it.
Subchapter T, here are the principles of this. Operating on a cooperative basis is a very broad and general term that's not really even defined in the tax law. except through, history of case law and our U.S. announcements. I'm sorry, the tax, the Treasury Department's announcements. But it includes operating on a cooperative basis means that you figure out what your taxable income is as a quote corporation. But then if you're passing your taxable income across to your members or giving it back to them, then you don't have to pay tax on it at the co-op level. And that's the basic structure of subchapter T. You calculate income tax just like you do for any other corporation. But if you allocate the income to your members, and the tax law uses the term patron, I don't know why, but rather than user, but that's basically what a patron is. It's the person who buys electricity, for example, from a rural electric co-op, or the person who buys food from a natural food co-op, or the employee in a worker co-op is patronizing it. And as long as you pay at least 20% of that income out in cash to your members annually, and allocate that income to them within 8.5 months after the end of every fiscal year. And you have an obligation to do it ahead of time. And you let the members know what their allocation is.
Recording in progress.
Then you don't have to pay tax at the co-op level. So for a co-op that is 100% doing business with interacting with its members, and they're the owners and they have the income or the ownership rights, then a co-op can pay no tax at all.
And I'll add just a little bitty thing there, Dave, about the members must accept payment, is that if you send your members a check for patronage and they don't cash it, then that is not acceptance, and that money becomes taxable. So that's why that extra little bit is there, is that acceptance of the payment also ensures tax deductibility.
Right, and that also brings up, Robyn, I'm sure you deal with this, maybe not so much, but in consumer co-ops, that's a really big deal, is unclaimed property laws. If you allocate income to a member and then they move out of town and you don't keep track of them, if you ever do pay that capital back to that member, most of the states, not all, maybe at least 2/3 or a half, say that if you're going to pay that capital back and you can't find that member, or they don't cash the check, then you end up having to treat it as unclaimed property and they're, pay it to the states.
Right.
States all have that. Okay. Thank you. So here's a couple different types of co-ops that are a little different than that from a tax standpoint. And I've talked about the rural utility, telephone and water and electric. They have a special tax exempt status. So do the credit unions and mutual insurance companies, and an awful lot of insurance is done by co-ops, but they're actually exempt from tax, so they don't have to do this, pay 20% of their income back to their members and pay taxes on non-member business. So let's go to the next slide, Robyn.
Okay. So we'll move away from the detail of the tax law. And thank you, Megan. I think you've been posting some of the detail information. There's no way to do justice to all the detail in the space of 30 minutes. So Dave and I are trying to just hit the high points of the things that are that you most want to think of. So, you know, now that we understand sort of some of what is drives that, how you achieve tax deductibility of patronage, want to talk a little bit about, well, why would you, what are the other reasons for issuing a qualified patronage refund? And there's a qualified patronage and there's non-qualified patronage. I'm not going to try to go into the difference, just pointing out that there's a lot of different wrinkles in here that are worth looking into. And of course, first reason is the tax deductibility. We've already talked about that. It is tax deductible to the co-op, and in some cases, it's also deductible to the owners. But secondarily, it provides a monetary return to the patron, who is essentially an investor in the cooperative, and it's appropriate for there to be some tangible and individual return to the owner. But a couple of things about why to do a monetary return that's patronage versus, for instance, some food co-ops provide discounts to their members. One is that it's paid out of surplus earnings. You ensure that all of the costs of the business have already been covered before you and you pay patronage out of excess earnings, surplus earnings. So you're not paying out money that you don't actually have. It's actually surplus. And on a similar vein, paying out patronage based on surplus earnings means that you are bringing a particular focus to the importance of margin or net income or surplus to your business, which is also a nod to the need for health and sustainability of the business. As Tamala reminded me a couple of days ago, there's no margin, there's no mission without margin. And this ties the importance of the continuity of the business back to providing a return to the investor in that business. Patronage is also a great source of capital for a cooperative. Every company needs capital to run the business, and there are many different forms of capital. Equity capital, which comes from your investors, is far less expensive than debt capital, and patronage is a form of equity capital. It comes from the out of the operations of the business, and it would go into retained earnings, which is a form of which is a part of the equity of the business. We've learned that it can be tax-free if you check all the IRS boxes. It's also interest-free, so you're not paying interest to anybody. And so for a company or cooperative that needs to grow, this is a great way of generating capital for growth purposes. And the final bullet here is about reinforcing the dual role of the cooperative member, that your consumer or patron or user is using or buying the products or services of the cooperative, and benefits from that primary use of the cooperative. They also benefit from the benefits that the cooperative brings to the community, but as an owner, they also should get a benefit. And so the patronage is this nice tie between the use of the cooperative and as a consumer, as well as the ownership in the cooperative in the form of patronage refunds. And so you can use that as a way of communicating to your members, like you're using the co-op and you're also getting a patronage back from the co-op, and it's a good way of communicating with your members. Maisha, last slide, please. Thank you. So that brings us to kind of an interesting what I think is the most interesting part of the conversation about patronage is the planning conversations that have to happen at the board level regarding patronage. If your co-op is fortunate enough to have an earnings surplus, well, the board has to decide, well, what should we do with our surplus, and how much if any of our surplus should we declare as patronage? Do we have are the bylaws set out in the right way for us to be able to declare patronage and get tax deduction on it? How much of that patronage should be retained versus how much should it be paid out? What are our cash needs in the business? Are we growing and therefore we need cash to grow? Do we have projects that need to be funded and therefore we would benefit from having that retained capital to use in the business? Or are we more mature and we don't have projects that we need to fund, in which case we should be paying out more of our patronage to our members? And that is a really high level conversation that every board should be having about what should be done with the excess earnings. There are other, the patronage is a one type of tax shield from paying taxes. There are other tax shields that cooperatives might have that the board should have a conversation about. How much should be used for this type of tax shield versus another type of tax shield. And in general, and overarching all of this is what state laws apply to our cooperative. Dave and I are talking about, lots of different types of co-ops, different structures for tax purposes, things that are required by by state law in order to achieve tax deductibility. And it's really important to determine what laws apply in your state. So those are, some of the topics that Dave and I wanted to bring up around using about patronage in general and about how to use patronage to shield your cooperative from tax burden, which is a very efficient way of using your cooperative's resources.
So, Robyn, if I could just add to that,
of course.
How much capital you need in a co-op depends entirely on. It varies dramatically from one to another, and for like a electric co-op, or a natural foods co-op, you have pretty intense capital needs. You have to have money to be able to get a store started.
And to replace equipment in a store also. Right,
and it's not just once, it's ongoing.
It's ongoing.
But some co-ops, like a lot of the purchasing co-ops that are, that there's tons of those, and it's people, it's sort of like independent distributors, maybe is one way to look at it, like who have a really hard time competing on price for the products that they're distributing. Because they're small. And I'd say NCG is one of these. It's like a joint purchasing group for natural foods co-ops around the country. It allows you to get the natural foods co-ops to get better pricing than if they were just doing it on their own completely. And some of those are fairly, they don't have many assets. They don't have a lot of infrastructure. Maybe have a really small staff that just manages contracts with vendors. And I think, who was it? The gentleman from Wisconsin who you're
Josh.
in one of those. Yeah, Josh, yes. That, you don't, some of them have warehouses like Ace Hardware. But many of them just have, all they really do is an office and manage contracts, and it saves money for people buying together. And in a lot of respects, that's kind of what a natural foods co-op is, isn't it? It started off with, in the 60s or something, with hippies who couldn't find kelp anywhere, so they started buying it, in little local collectives, and now there are some pretty significant stores.
So I didn't go into my my co-op history, which is way shorter than Dave's. I've been with NCG for 3 years, and that has been that's my co-op history. I'm a relative co-op baby compared to everybody else. I came from a consulting and banking background, and actually a nonprofit background too.
Well, I have a similar background, Robyn, in association management and nonprofits. Excellent. Well, thank you all both for sharing such great information today.
Well, Steve, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you. Actually, I think it's pretty a cool story.
No, you did not offend me. I don't mind being called a hippie.
Well, Robyn and Dave, was there anything else that you wanted to share, or any questions that you wanted to give out to the group within our final few minutes?
Well, all I'll say is an hour goes awful fast, doesn't it?
It does. You blink, and it's done. Just like we talked about at time at the beginning of the call. Was there any questions that you all had as audience and participants? I mean, it's not quite a lecture, but I know there was some great information that, we wanted to make sure we dedicated time to share today. But was there any questions that you all might have for Robyn and Dave?
We answered all the questions, Maisha.
I see.
No, absolutely.
I have a question that's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but is there any kind of a formula that you would recommend for determining how much to save in reserves versus paying out in patronage, or is it just situation dependent?
It depends on it depends on your own personal, your own co-op situation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was talking about the purchasing co-ops that maybe don't have anything except an office and negotiate contracts. They can send back almost all of the profit, all of the savings as, cash as opposed to capital. But even them, might need to have some capital. You got to have a, copy machine and pay rent and some things like that. But if you're a natural foods co-op and you're building a new store, it's a lot harder to pay large amounts out as cash because you need equity on the balance sheet, or to support that asset.
Mhm.
Thank you.
And even for a purchasing co-op, I mean, if you've got a new business of some sort that you're building that requires some level of capital, then you're going to want to retain some.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it completely depends on what the capital needs are at that moment and into the plannable future.
Okay.
So we
Absolutely.
encountered that, and I mean, for years this organization gave back everything, and there was this idea that we had equity. And when I got here 8 years ago now, I said that's not our equity. It's actually our members' equity. So yes, we have cash flow. We don't really have money that we can use without saying to membership, hey, we used your money. And one thing that popped up was a new program for our coalition, our cooperative, to do for our members, but we needed our upfront money in order to do it. So as a matter of, we had to plan for that, and we've now switched. So we're going to start. We did a couple years ago now. Start retaining some allocated equity. Yeah. And my preach has been, it's still our members' money. It's just a matter of, is it allocated to them or not allocated to them?
Yeah.
So. And I will add to that, Josh, it's allocated to them, but the board has to decide that it's going to be paid out. And until then, it's organizational capital. And then there's some semantics in there, but the board has to resolve to pay it out. And if the board decides that there are capital needs in the organization, then it is not yet, what would be the words? It's not yet, payable to the members.
Yeah.
There's a lot of co-ops, and the natural foods co-ops have really adopted this in order to, retail, in order to build a store and have all the equipment you need in there, you're either borrow money or you have capital on your balance sheet. And so the natural foods co-ops supplement that with member loans and preferred stock, which ends up, it's positive to their balance sheet and their ability to borrow money at a reasonable rate. And it's a big cushion, but it's just an investment by the members who put that money in.
And it's still more expensive than retaining patronage. If
Right.
you've got any requirement to pay out preferred dividends and certain member loans.
Patronage is almost never has a dividend or return on it, but there was some farm co-ops it still do this, but it's kind of become not so popular, but like in Illinois, where the local farm supply co-op would issue preferred stock to their members that paid a dividend. And as part of so they could retain the capital on their balance sheet, but they were paying a dividend to their members.
Maisha, do we have time for Margaret's question? She had her hand up.
One more. We have just another minute. Go right on ahead.
I was just interested in the history of the exemption of the consumer food co-ops from patronage.
Margaret, you're cutting in and out.
Oh.
The exemption of
The natural food co-ops, the consumer food.
The exemption from what, tax?
Right.
Yeah, well, the natural foods co-ops, most of them, and especially as they get bigger, are going to have some taxable business and some non-tax business, because they do some with their members, but they also do a lot with non-members. And so a subchapter T, that exclusion of tax only applies to your business with members. And many co-ops, and I think most natural foods co-ops, have non-member business that might even, be a lot more than their member business. And they pay tax on that, just like any other corporation, right, Robyn?
There's not a whole lot of taxable income in general in a food
In a
co-op,
natural
Dave,
foods co-op,
but
yeah.
theoretically, yes.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you both for answering Margaret's question. Excellent. Well, I know that there might be a few more questions that come up after today's conversation. And I did see Robyn and Dave drop their contact information in the chat. So I will hang back for an extra 60 seconds in case you want to copy and paste that, or write it down on a sticky note beside you. But again, we appreciate you taking the time to participate and join in today's conversation.
And I appreciate the chance to collaborate with you, Robyn. It was very nice.
Likewise. Good working with you, Dave. Thank you, Maisha.
No problem. We appreciate it. We hope you all have a wonderful weekend and a happy holidays. And for those of you who tend to continuously join our happy hours, and we hope the rest of you will as well, this will be the final Co-op Circle happy hour that we will have for the year. We will rejoin you next month in January. The first, it won't be the first Friday in January, but the first happy hour we'll have in 2023 will be on January 13th. Yes, that is Friday the 13th, I know. From 1 p.m. Eastern time. And that conversation will focus on climate change. So we do hope that you will join us and mark your calendars and check out Co-op Circle to make sure that you see what future events we'll have. Excellent.
Ron, that you ask a very complex question there. I just have to throw that out. That'd be a topic maybe for another day, but having a worker co-op versus an ESOP versus, there's a lot of, and it's fairly simple when you're starting a business, but if you're trying to change a business from a corporation or a sole ownership to worker ownership, it's more complicated.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dave, for answering that question too. I definitely apologize for missing that one, Ron. And we should add this one to Co-op Circle because I think it would be an interesting dialogue.
You could definitely have a I'd easily take an hour talking about that.
Oh, yeah.
Look forward to it. Thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome.
All right, everyone
Yeah,
have
I'll
a great
vote for that
weekend.
one too.
All righty, everyone. Thank
See
you
you.
all so much.
Happy Friday, everybody.
Happy
Happy
Friday.
holidays.
Happy holidays.
Bye-bye.
Again.